Welcome to the Tim Booker channel, where the wisdom of virtue is shared. We wish you a pleasant listening experience. Today, I'm going to interpret this book for you, titled Chip War, with the subtitle, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology. The topic of this book is likely a hot issue in recent years, the competition in the field of semiconductors between the United States and other countries worldwide. In recent years, the competition regarding semiconductors between the United States and China has become increasingly intense. However, if we dig deeper, we will discover that there are many aspects of this semiconductor competition that we don't fully understand. There has been significant technological progress in the world in recent years, so why is the United States so sensitive about the semiconductor field? Why does the United States have such strong influence in the semiconductor industry? Furthermore, how will this semiconductor competition impact the future of the world? The answers to these questions may not be immediately clear, and we need to look back at history. Through this book, you will discover that this is a saga of more than 60 years filled with love and hate. The author of this book, Chris Miller, is an associate professor of international history at Tufts University in the United States. He is also a researcher at a U.S. think tank and a contributor to the New York Times. He extensively researched and conducted over 100 interviews with experts in the semiconductor industry, academia, and government to write this book. The story in this book is filled with ups and downs, with countries and the United States engaging in fierce competition in the semiconductor field over the past few decades. In this audio segment, we will first discuss how the United States established its leading position in the semiconductor field, and later, we will delve into the semiconductor wars between the United States and other countries. Before diving into the story, we need to provide a bit of background because without understanding the basics of semiconductors, you might not fully grasp what's at stake in the story. But don't worry, I won't delve into complex formulas. We'll explain simply why semiconductors are so important. So, what exactly is a chip? In the simplest terms, a chip is essentially an electronic circuit. In the age of electronics and information technology, circuits form the foundation of everything. In the past, circuits relied on mechanical controls, and today, electrical switches still work this way. In 1945, a scientist at Bell Labs in the United States named Shockley stumbled upon semiconductors and discovered their remarkable property: changing voltage could turn them on and off like switches. In other words, with semiconductors, people could use electricity to control electricity. Turning electricity on and off could represent zeros and ones, enabling all sorts of calculations. This forms the basis for today's computers, the internet, smartphones, and various electronic devices and smart appliances. The more semiconductor components you can fit on a chip, the more powerful the circuit becomes. The problem was that with traditional circuits, all these components were soldered onto circuit boards and connected with wires, which made things very complicated. If you've ever taken apart an old radio or television, you've likely seen the complexity inside. Manufacturing circuits this way was troublesome, consumed a lot of power, and was prone to malfunctions. At this point, Shockley had a young genius on his team who had a brilliant idea: since the core of these circuits is made from semiconductors, could we carve out these components directly on a semiconductor material? It turned out this idea was viable, and it allowed for very small components, enabling even more complex circuits. Previously, circuits soldered together might have a few hundred components, but with advancing technology, circuits etched onto semiconductors could accommodate tens of thousands or even billions of components. This allowed for more complex computations. The development of our information technology today is fundamentally driven by the ability to fit more semiconductor components on the same size chip. These circuits etched onto semiconductors are called integrated circuits, and colloquially, they are known as chips. So, when we discuss this story, for convenience, I will refer to them all as chips. Now, we can officially dive into the story. Where should we begin this tale? Let's start on a seemingly ordinary night over 60 years ago. It was a winter night in 1958, on the streets of Washington. Three young men had just finished drinking, humming songs, and walking back to their hotel, facing the falling snowflakes. Certainly, the people passing them on the street had no idea that, over the next half-century, these young men would become tech giants, wielding the power to change the world. Among these three young men was the renowned Gordon Moore, yes, the same Moore who proposed Moore's Law. Another young man was Robert Noyce, the brilliant young inventor we mentioned earlier, who would, a decade later, become one of the co-founders of Intel. There was also a Chinese-American scientist named Zhang Zhongmou. You might not be familiar with this name, but in the upcoming story, he will play a crucial role. This book takes this moment as the starting point of the story. This timing is well chosen because, at this point, the semiconductor, as an invention, had already received validation from science and technology. Still, it had not yet formed an industry because it needed to pass the test of commerce. Today, we all understand the importance of semiconductors. However, looking back then, this new invention seemed a bit slippery and impractical. This was because, at the time, it cost 50 times more to create a circuit on a semiconductor than to solder one onto a circuit board. Moore and Noyce saw the immense potential of the chip, so they teamed up with others to establish Fairchild Semiconductor Corporation. This company later became very famous, and it can be said that without Fairchild, there would be no Silicon Valley as we know it today. However, at that time, this newly formed company faced a rather dire situation because no one in the market was willing to foot the bill for this expensive new invention. To scale up chip production, there needed to be demand in the market. The cost of producing chips on a large scale needed to come down. As costs came down, more industries would be willing to adopt chips, which would, in turn, create more demand in the market. This is how the chip industry could enter a virtuous cycle. So, at that time, they urgently needed a large order to kickstart this cycle. Surprisingly, Fairchild received its first major order from the Soviet Union. In 1957, the Soviets successfully launched the first artificial satellite. 4 years later, Soviet astronaut Gagarin became the first person to enter space. These successive Soviet achievements shook the United States. As a country that prided itself on being a technological superpower, the United States felt like it was falling behind. The U.S. government urgently launched a space program, announcing its intention to send astronauts to the moon. Such a space program naturally required rockets, and using chips to control these rockets was advantageous because they were lighter and more energy efficient than traditional circuits. The space program prioritized performance over cost, which brought Fairchild a significant business opportunity. On the other hand, the U.S. military also began purchasing chips. During the Cold War, the U.S. military aimed to develop a missile capable of launching nuclear warheads into space to strike the Soviet Union. The problem was that these missiles required precision guidance, and the traditional computers of the time were too large and heavy, affecting missile performance. If the missiles could use chips for computing, their performance could double while their weight would only be half of what it was before. Similarly, the military valued performance and was willing to pay for high-performance chips. This way, NASA and the U.S. military became the first major customers of the chip industry. As time passed, the military's demand for chips grew, and satellites, sonar, torpedoes, radar, and various weapons began to adopt chips. In the late 1960s, 95% of chips produced in the United States were used in military and aerospace applications. In just 2 years, Fairchild sales soared from $500,000 to $21 million, growing into a large company with 1,000 employees. With this initial injection of capital into the chip industry, the virtuous cycle we mentioned earlier truly took off, and chip costs began to decrease. In less than 10 years, the price of Fairchild chips dropped from $20 to $2. This opened up the civilian market as well, with various manufacturers purchasing chips for items such as hearing aids and radios. Especially in the field of computing, chips allowed computers to be more powerful and smaller in size, giving them the potential to enter both businesses and households. This further expanded the market for chips. At the time, one computer company purchased 20 million chips within a year, more than 20 times the number used in the lunar program. By the late 1960s, the number of chips purchased in the civilian computer industry had become as significant as the military's demand. Furthermore, civilian demand continued to grow, and the chip sector became a hotbed of opportunity. When a Fairchild employee left the company, they boldly wrote on the company's exit survey, "I want to get rich." The influx of significant funds into the chip industry set it on a fast track to development. However, a field that concerned national security and was worth a fortune would inevitably lead to a global competition, and the United States wouldn't remain the sole dominant player for long. Sooner or later, it would become a game for various nations to navigate. So, the first formidable challenger to the United States had emerged, and that challenger was the Soviet Union. The Soviets quickly recognized the importance of chips in the defense and aerospace sectors, and they decided to develop their own chip industry. They even built a new city on the outskirts of Moscow dedicated to chip research and development. This city housed universities, laboratories, factories, and provided facilities such as hospitals, kindergartens, and cinemas for the workforce. The Soviets were ambitious. They didn't settle for making this city a second Silicon Valley. They believed that the Soviet chip industry would surpass the United States. And it wasn't baseless optimism. If we go back to that time, it would seem that the Soviet Union indeed had the capability to compete with, or even surpass, the United States in the chip field. First, in terms of research capability, we mentioned earlier that the semiconductor field's founding father, Shockley, later became a professor at Stanford University and authored a textbook, which was quickly translated into Russian. The Soviet Union had world-class physicists at the time, and their research in the chip field was almost synchronous with the United States. Second, in terms of intelligence, the Soviet consulate in San Francisco had a team of 60 intelligence agents specifically tasked with collecting technology intelligence from Silicon Valley. These agents would recruit American tech personnel, use Swiss shell companies to import chips, and even infiltrate Intel's factories for espionage. In summary, the Soviets could always obtain the latest American chips. Given all this, it might seem that the Soviet Union had the resources and intelligence to catch up with or even surpass the United States in the chip field. However, the reality was different. In 1985, the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, conducted research on Soviet chips and found that these copies were consistently 5 years behind the United States, neither faster nor slower, just as precise as a clock. So, why could the Soviet Union only follow in the United States' footsteps step by step? This book analyzes many reasons, but the biggest one might be that Soviet scientists and engineers had no room for independent innovation, their hands were tied. This was because the Soviet Union adopted a replication strategy in the chip field. The orders from the higher-ups were to replicate American chips 1:1. If the Americans used inches, the Soviets used inches, not centimeters. This made it unlikely to make mistakes, but it also meant that the Soviet Union was essentially following in America's footsteps, step by step. While the United States moved forward in a straight line, the Soviet Union did the same. When the United States turned a corner, the Soviet Union followed suit. This essentially eliminated the possibility of surpassing the United States. Another limitation was that almost all of the Soviet chips were delivered to the military, without developing a civilian market. As you've heard from the previous stories, in the United States, the chip market matured with both military and civilian applications, with civilian consumption becoming the dominant leg of growth over time. However, the Soviet Union had almost no consumer market and relied excessively on military customers. This was like the Soviet Union trying to catch up to the United States while hopping on one leg. It became increasingly difficult. In 1990, the last Soviet leader, Gorbachev, visited Silicon Valley. During a speech at Stanford University, he told the audience that the Cold War was over, and there was no need to argue over who had won. But this was probably just a stubborn statement from him. In the following years, the once highly anticipated Soviet chip factories eventually fell to the point where they could only produce small chips for McDonald's toys. The outcome of the chip war between the Soviet Union and the United States was clear. The aftermath of this chip battle continued into the 2022 Russia-Ukraine conflict. With the end of the Cold War, most Russian customers stopped buying domestically produced guided chips, causing the Russian chip industry to decline completely. On the battlefields of Russia and Ukraine, it was discovered that Russian drones heavily relied on foreign chips. As for more critical weapons, such as guided missiles, they became challenging to produce due to the limitations of chip supply. Because of chip restrictions from the United States and Europe, Russia experienced a shortage of cruise missiles in the early weeks of the conflict. This book quotes a report from U.S. intelligence agencies, revealing that Russian factories had to dismantle chips from wristwatches to use in missile systems, highlighting the desperate situation they faced when dealing with chip shortages. However, the departure of the Soviet Union didn't entirely put the United States at ease because they discovered that another challenger had emerged. This challenger was Japan. Japan's challenge was different from the Soviet Union. While the Soviet Union immediately positioned itself in direct opposition to the United States, Japan initially aligned itself with the United States, striving to integrate into the American chip industry network. Let's take the renowned Japanese company Sony as an example. Sony's founder, Akio Morita, realized the tremendous potential of semiconductors as early as 1948, and when chips were born, Sony quickly followed suit. However, Sony did not aim for top defense and aerospace contracts. They focused on using chips in everyday products like radios and calculators. The United States also considered Japan a strategic and economic ally, so the chip industry was essentially open to Japan, and they were given authorization early on. Of course, Sony could only produce chips that were one generation behind, so they dutifully paid patent fees to the United States. During this time, Japan and the United States formed a symbiotic relationship in the chip field. The United States produced the most advanced chips, while Japan produced slightly inferior chips. The United States had the military market, and Japan focused on the consumer market. On the surface, Japan appeared to be running the race with just one leg, the consumer market. However, the problem was that this consumer market was growing rapidly, making Japan's leg increasingly robust. For example, Intel developed a DRAM chip, which we commonly refer to as memory. When you buy a computer or smartphone with 8 GB or 16 GB of memory, you're using DRAM chips. You can imagine how significant the demand for these chips is in the market, even just in the personal computer sector. It's a staggering figure. Because Intel was the inventor of DRAM, American DRAM chips initially sold well. Japan also started making chips, but they could only capture some lower-end markets. At that time, in the eyes of the United States, made in Japan was often associated with being cheap and of low quality. However, by the 1980s, an American chip industry executive conducted a survey and found that the quality of Japanese chips had surpassed that of American chips. He compared 3 Japanese companies with 3 American companies and calculated the chip failure rates. He discovered that even the best American company had a chip failure rate more than 4 times higher than the Japanese companies, while the worst American company had a failure rate over 10 times higher than the Japanese ones. This meant that Japanese chips were cheaper and more reliable. So, why would anyone still buy American chips? Moreover, Japanese companies had bigger ambitions. They knew that if they merely copied American products, they would only achieve second-tier status and profits. To achieve more, they needed to create entirely new products. The most representative example is the Walkman introduced by Sony, with 385 million units sold worldwide, becoming one of the most popular consumer products in history. Each Walkman contained chips from that era, and new products brought new demands, driving Japan's chip industry. By the 1980s, consumer electronics had become Japan's specialty, making Japan a chip powerhouse and even hinting at surpassing the United States. The company that initially introduced DRAM chips, Intel, now only held a meager 1.7% of the global market share. By 1990, half of the world's chip manufacturing factories were owned by Japanese companies. Although Japan had only one leg in the race, the consumer market, that leg was becoming increasingly strong. Meanwhile, in the United States, while they had 2 legs to walk with, their consumer market leg was getting weaker. At this point, Japan inevitably wondered if it could surpass the United States. Sony's founder, Akio Morita, even authored a book titled The Japan That Can Say No, where the core message was that Japan was no longer dependent on the United States, it was the United States that depended on Japan. This made the United States very angry, and of course, they had to retaliate. In the low-end chip market, the United States chose to court South Korea. At the time, the South Korean government provided large loans to Samsung, assisting them in developing the chip industry. South Korea's rise was bound to shake Japan's position, and the Americans thought, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. If the second and third players fought each other, the number 1 player's position would be secure. American companies directly transferred chip manufacturing technology to Samsung, and Intel even allowed Samsung to put their label on chips. By 1998, South Korea's memory production exceeded Japan's, and Japan's market share plummeted from a peak of 90% to 20%. What's even more crucial is that the United States once again took the lead in high-end chips. This included a notable transformation by Intel's CEO at the time, Andy Grove. He later wrote a famous book titled Only the Paranoid Survive. Grove realized that Intel was bound to lose to Japan in the memory business but wasn't sure about the future of CPUs. Memory business was profitable in the present, but CPUs had an uncertain future. Grove had a famous conversation with Gordon Moore, one of Intel's founders. Grove asked Moore, if we were kicked out and the board brought in a new CEO, what do you think he would do? Moore believed that a new CEO would abandon the memory business and focus on CPU development. Grove made the bold decision to complete this transformation himself. The results, as we know, were in favor of Intel. Almost every computer today uses Intel CPUs. Not only did Intel rejuvenate, but the United States also regained its position as the leader in the chip industry. In addition to this, the U.S. military continuously supported innovation in the U.S. chip industry with substantial funding. Notably, a completely new chip design method emerged. In the early days of chip design, engineers would draw layouts by hand with colored pencils, but chips became increasingly complex, and manual design became impractical. So, two computer scientists invented a software-based method for designing chips. With the support of the military, this method matured, giving rise to a new industry, chip design software tools. This innovation has had a profound and lasting impact, as today, everyone uses American-designed software tools for chip design. In conclusion, with the help of innovation, the United States once again secured its leading position. Meanwhile, Japan realized that its market position was not set in stone. In this give-and-take scenario, Japan's challenge ultimately ended in failure. Finally, let's talk about China. As we mentioned earlier, the chip industry walks on two legs, defense and civilian applications. China is now fully capable of independently producing core-level chips crucial for defense applications. Now, let's focus on the civilian market. Truth be told, in the realm of consumer electronics, China, at the beginning, wasn't particularly competitive, even in the Asian chip market. In the 1980s, many Asian countries sought a place in the chip market. The most successful, as we've mentioned before, were Japan and South Korea. Following them were Singapore and Malaysia, learning from South Korea and transitioning from chip assembly to autonomous chip manufacturing. China, however, lagged behind during that period. Taiwan, a part of China, mainly handled chip packaging and testing, which was the lowest end of the chip industry with less technological content and more labor-intensive work. Mainland China had just embarked on its reform and opening up journey and could only follow Taiwan's model if it entered the chip industry. But there was one individual who almost single-handedly disrupted this pattern, and that person is Morris Chang. He was born in mainland China, grew up in Hong Kong, and later went to the United States. He first attended Harvard University and then transferred to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. Like Moore and Noyce, he was one of the earliest participants in the semiconductor industry and had a solid grasp of both technology and management. In the 1980s, Taiwan invited Morris Chang to assist in upgrading its chip industry. Morris Chang then founded the famous TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, and developed an unprecedented industrial model. What kind of model was it? In the past, each company in the chip industry had its chip factory, designed its chips, and manufactured them. At most, American companies set up factories in Southeast Asia to save some labor costs. However, Morris Chang felt this wasn't right. He used an analogy: it was like every writer needing their own printing press, which was too burdensome. Instead, there should be a company dedicated to chip manufacturing. Others could provide their chip designs, and this specialized company would manufacture them. Actually, at that time, some small companies were already considering focusing on chip design and having giants like Intel manufacture their chips. However, this model didn't work well as large companies thought the volumes were too small to bother with, while small companies were afraid of their designs being copied. When TSMC started operations, this outsourced manufacturing model finally gained traction. Previously, chip manufacturing was a very capital-intensive business, but now, it was just about chip design, significantly reducing costs. Silicon Valley saw a surge in startups, and creativity in the chip industry was reignited. Among these small companies was NVIDIA, initially producing graphics cards and later upgrading them into GPUs. With the rise of artificial intelligence, it was discovered that GPUs were particularly suitable for training AI models. As a result, NVIDIA gained increasing attention, and TSMC played a pivotal role in its rise. The founder of NVIDIA even stated that if he had to build his own factory to produce GPU chips, he might still be the CEO of a comfortable company worth tens of millions of dollars. While that might sound like a lot, you should know that Nvidia's current market value is in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Apple is another company that greatly benefited from TSMC's services and continues to be one of its biggest clients. In addition to this, Morris Chang did two more things to consolidate TSMC's position in the industry. First, TSMC insisted on not designing chips itself, ensuring that customers could comfortably entrust their designs for manufacturing. Second, TSMC formed a large alliance with a chain of allies, including chip design companies, lithography machine manufacturers, and semiconductor material companies. They collectively conducted research and progressed together. This large alliance ensured that TSMC always had the most advanced chip manufacturing technology while keeping production costs down, making more companies willing to have their chips manufactured by TSMC. As a result, the U.S. chip manufacturing industry quickly declined. By the 1990s, only Intel remained as a major chip manufacturer in the United States. Mainland China also followed a similar path laid out by Morris Chang. SMIC, Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, founded around 2000, was essentially emulating TSMC's model. In theory, this situation should have led to a mutual dependence between China and the United States in the chip field. Design and manufacturing were interconnected, and both would suffer if one withdrew. From the U.S. perspective, having an additional consumer market, especially one as vast as China, would naturally mean more profits. Additionally, having one more chip manufacturer could prevent TSMC from monopolizing and raising prices. It seemed like a win-win scenario for the chip industry. So why did the United States harbor such great animosity towards China in the chip domain? This book provides a straightforward answer. Although the U.S. gave various reasons, the core reason was that China's rapid progress in chips made the U.S. feel threatened. They believed that if China's electronics industry continued to prosper, and China bought more high-end chips, the global chip industry would become increasingly dependent on China. This is also why the U.S. specifically targeted companies like Huawei, as Huawei was continually making strides in the chip sector. Of course, this perspective is unique to the United States and can be seen as a form of paranoia. Many European countries, for example, believe that China's technological rise is inevitable but don't perceive it as a threat. They are more willing to cooperate with China. As the author mentions in the book, the ongoing question in the chip industry is how China will respond to the latest escalation in the chip war, whether it will retreat or redouble its efforts. With that, I've summarized the key content of this book for you. Congratulations on completing another book. Thank you for your support and attention. Please subscribe to the Tim Booker Channel audiobook channel. Like and share it with your family and friends. Wisdom is worth spreading, and it opens the way to a better future. Thank you, and goodbye.